I'm Scott.
I'm Bill.
And we're the Trade Guys.
You're listening to The Trade Guys, a podcast produced by CSIS where we talk about trade in terms that everyone can understand. I'm H. Andrew Schwartz, and I'm here with Scott Miller and Bill Reinsch, the CSIS Trade Guys.
This is Trade Guy Scott. Thanks for listening to The Trade Guys. This week, we have a special guest, Professor Doug Irwin, the John French Professor of Economics at Dartmouth College and one of the most prolific authors on the history of American trade policy. We have a wonderful conversation with Bill and another special guest, but please enjoy this program with Professor Irwin talking about the Trump trade policy in the context of American history. Thanks for listening.
Well, welcome everybody. This is Trade Guy Bill with Trade Guy Scott, and we have two special guests today. This is a real treat. I'm particularly excited that we have with us Douglas Irwin, who is one of the most prominent trade economists in the country. For the ones that are still living, I mean, there are a number of trade economists that are dead, but Doug stands head and shoulders amongst the ones that are still with us. He is the author of multiple books, Free Trade Under Fire, which I've actually taught and think is a wonderful description of what's going on. Now in its fifth edition, or maybe it's a later edition, but I have the fifth. And then another one called Clashing Over Commerce, which is a total history of U.S. trade policy, which is in the tome category. Scott, 800 odd pages. So if you're a real trade wonk, get that one. Either way, if you really want to know not only what's going on, but what has been going on for the last 200 years, Doug is the person to listen to and talk to, and we're just delighted that he's here. And I'm going to hit him with a question, but I also want to let our listeners know that we have a special guest as well, and that's Barbara Weisel, who most of you probably know, longtime USTR negotiator of TPP, as I recall. Not entirely a successful outcome, but a distinguished career there, and then went on to a career at Rock Creek Advisory Partners. And she's been visiting today, so I asked her to sit in, and we're mostly going to talk to Doug, but if Barbara has something to say, and I wouldn't be surprised if she does, we'll be hearing from her as well. So let's start with, I know the question that's on everybody's mind, thanks to the president, is what's the deal with Bill McKinley? Hero, villain, delusionary? I attended a webinar yesterday with Karl Rove, who's written a book on McKinley, and said that McKinley was enormously popular in his day and not as big a high tariff guy as one would think, or as Trump would say. But tell us a little bit about him and his tariff role, and is he really responsible for all the growth that occurred in the second half of the 19th century? Or if not, who do we praise for that?
Well, first of all, thanks for you inviting me. It's a great honor and pleasure to be here. I'm a longtime listener, so to be on the podcast is wonderful. I've always thought that Karl Rove probably introduced McKinley to Trump. And you're right. Rove, I think, really liked McKinley because he was instrumental in bringing together the Republican coalition in the 1890s and into the 20th century. But of course, he's known for the tariff as well, as the president has pointed out. And I've always said there are sort of two McKinleys. The first McKinley is when he was a member of Congress representing a district in Ohio, and he was chair of the House Ways and Means Committee, and he ushered through the McKinley tariff of 1890. And this is sort of where his high tariff views get promulgated to some extent. They were pushing the tariff levels up. And here's where Rove's caveat sort of is important too, because he admitted later on that the rates were probably higher than he wanted, but there was some momentum to the political process in putting them up. So he was for higher tariffs, but maybe not extreme
Same momentum
tariffs.
in Smoot-Hawley, I would think. Log rolling?
Yes.
I'll raise yours if you'll raise mine.
Exactly. Once you sort of get tariffs going in Congress, there's no necessary stop to it. But then there's McKinley as president. And this is the really interesting time because he did sign a tariff bill that raised tariff rates that was based on a Democratic legislation that reduced them earlier in the 1890s. But in his second term, he gave a famous address at Buffalo in 1901, September of 1901, where he said, the age of exclusiveness is over. We have to look to other markets as a vent for our production. Commercial wars are unprofitable and not good to have. And he wanted to move towards reciprocity. And by that, he meant possibly the U.S. reducing its tariff if other countries would reduce theirs. Unfortunately, he was shot the next day or shortly thereafter, passed away, and we'll never know whether that would have come to fruition. But he did change course a bit as president against his high tariff views.
But isn't that basically what Trump is saying? We're going to impose higher tariffs, but if you lower yours, we'll lower ours?
Well, there's a couple of different interpretations to reciprocity. And McKinley was actually doing the one that President Roosevelt introduced in 1934 with the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act, which is let's move tariffs down if other countries will join us in that effort. And Trump has moved this more in terms of retaliation. We're going to move ours up because other countries have higher tariffs.
So did the McKinley tariff produce the growth that Trump said it produced?
Well, here's another sort of Smoot-Hawley analogy. Within 2 years of passing the McKinley tariff, we went into a depression. It wasn't our fault. It wasn't the tariff's fault. There was a financial crisis in Great Britain. The Barings Bank collapsed in 1893. And for about 4 or 5 years, we had an unemployment rate of over 10%. It was not a good time for the U.S. economy. But by the end of the 1890s, we were growing like gangbusters. Partly that's a recovery from that recession. But throughout the whole late 19th century into the 20th century, manufacturing output was growing at a fairly fast pace. We had a lot of minerals to be exploited. There's a lot of migration, immigration coming in. So manufacturing was a flourishing sector throughout this period.
Scott?
I'm delighted that both Barbara and Doug are here. And in particular, I've had a burning question for Doug, and it's mostly about why it is that the proponents of open markets are having such a rough time these days. We don't seem to be able to counter any of it. And in fact, we sound a lot like Chicken Little. Every time there's a president speaks, somebody out there from the pro-trade community says the sky is falling, and it may or may not be, but we're not doing a good job of countering it. And Doug, if you could think of this sort of past moves by political leaders in the U.S. on the use of tariffs, seems to me there are a couple schools. One is the one you just talked about, which is really from Henry Clay to Herbert Hoover, where tariffs were thought to be a good thing, and macroeconomics aside. Okay. The second was that while politicians understood that tariffs had a negative effect on macroeconomics, there were times and places and sectors where tariffs were appropriate. I'd characterize this as the Dick Gephardt view when he was House Majority Leader, where there was an allowance made for the use of tariffs. And then there's always been a national security argument with tariffs going back many decades. That is not totally rejected, and it is part of the current President Trump's arguments. That's another way to look at this. And then finally, I think there is the bargaining side of this, where the president probably understands tariffs, and actually imposing tariffs would be a harm to the economy, but threatening them is a pretty effective way to get things done. This is maybe the Jamie Dimon or Real Politics school. What do you think is going on, and how do we as people who advocate for open markets, how would we talk about this in a way that would be more persuasive?
Well, it's a great question and a challenging one. I think advocates of openness or liberalization have encountered a couple of headwinds over the past decade or so. First of all, we've had a big increase in inequality, income and wealth inequality. Although that's been flat for a number of years, it still has widened from the 1980s or so. And there's a lot of concern, particularly among younger people, about income distribution and fairness and things of that sort. We also have a period of large current account deficits. And I think regardless of whether one thinks that's a bad or good economic outcome, it does feed the narrative that we're not selling as much as other countries are to us. Therefore, there's some sort of unfairness or imbalance. And then I think the financial crisis also played a large role. So I know you've talked about the China shock, but I think the financial crisis played a bigger role because it really hurt the wealth of so many households in the U.S. The recovery was very slow. Unemployment didn't fall nearly as rapidly as we had hoped. And the lingering after effects of that gave sort of a taint to deregulation and open markets, even though open markets weren't directly associated with the financial crisis per se. So I think there's not one factor. There's a sort of a combination of things that have made it a difficult time for those advocating for open markets.
So if we go to higher tariffs now, as Trump has proposed, we've seen the Canada-Mexico threat, which is now off till early March. Then there is the steel aluminum ones that go into effect on March 12th on everybody without exceptions, including Canada and Mexico. Today, we're recording this on February 13th. Trump announced that he was directing the Commerce Department and the U.S. Trade Representative's Office to develop a system of reciprocal tariffs where we would match country by country, product by product, the tariffs of other countries, factoring in not only their tariffs, but also their unfair trade barriers, including the VAT, the value-added tax. What is all that going to mean for our economy if all those things actually end up happening?
Well, a lot of things could happen. We'll have to see what actually gets implemented. But there have been a number of independent economic studies of what would happen if we imposed higher tariffs. Talking about the Peterson Institute, the Tax Foundation, the Yale Budget Lab. No one finds a positive impact in terms of GDP. Everyone finds higher prices, so a blip to the consumer price index, which means lower real incomes for households. A lot of these studies also found that these tariffs are very regressive. So lower income households will bear more of the burden than higher income households. And the Congressional Budget Office has also found exactly these sorts of effects. So no one except for the Coalition for American Prosperity projects any sort of positive outcome. And the question is, I guess, the magnitudes and how big. And that depends on the size of the disruption, the uncertainty that's created. But it's hard to see that this ends well for the U.S. economy.
Well, that gets to the famous who pays question. Trump's view is the foreigners pay. And so Americans aren't going to be hurt. Basically, this is going to be a tax on the foreigners, and we're going to have a tax cut for the Americans, and everybody will be happy and will grow more. Is he right about that the foreigners pay the whole amount?
And a simple answer, no. So there have been a lot of studies. Well, first of all, it was an open question to some extent until the first Trump term, because we hadn't imposed many tariffs on many commodities, obviously anti-dumping and countervailing duties, but they tend to be country-specific rather than across the board. And we had a great experiment with the first Trump term. And a number of studies done by respected academics have found that basically the tariffs are passed through to consumers. So it doesn't necessarily mean households, but it does mean to the intermediate users, because many of the tariffs are on intermediate inputs, such as steel. As I say, I've never gone to Lowe's or Home Depot and bought a bar of steel myself, but I buy a lot of products that have steel in them.
Buy a lawnmower.
Exactly.
No.
Yep. So John Deere and Caterpillar, they're big buyers. They will pay the higher price. And that seems to be where the incidence is. It's within the U.S. It's not other countries cutting their export prices or absorbing the tariff.
Now, on steel and aluminum, his argument has been the overcapacity argument, the Chinese overcapacity argument, which we've talked about here on the podcast a number of times and think that there really is an overcapacity problem. It's very clear in both those commodities. And steel, China has now more capacity than the entire rest of the world put together. But is the right way to address that problem tariffs on everybody?
Well, the problem is that makes the U.S. a high-price island for steel, and it may divert steel to other markets, which sort of leads to more and more protectionism around the world. Actually, Barbara, this is a great question for you, because going back to the 1970s, we've been worried about overcapacity in steel, and it's been a recurring issue in U.S. trade politics. And it seems to me that the right approach is to try to negotiate with other countries some sort of arrangement for dealing with that capacity, rather than hurting U.S. manufacturers who rely on the steel input, pushing them overseas, making them less competitive, both in the U.S. market and in export markets, by doing this unilaterally.
Yeah, successive administrations have tried to negotiate steel deals, and nobody has really brought a deal together. But I think that in this case, it's another one of those situations where you know what the problem is. You know who you need around the table to address that problem, but we're not bringing people together to do that. We're going to impose the tariffs and then try to figure out how we're going to solve the problem.
Bill's right about China being the source of the overcapacity. But in this particular decision by the president, I think it's the European steelmakers who are going to have the most difficult time, mostly through increasing energy costs and general competitive conditions in Europe. But it seems to me that if we found the problem is China, and as a result, the Europeans are going to pay something like that, which doesn't sound right, but I don't know.
We have the same situation in electric vehicles, as you've noted on this program many, many times. And if we close our markets, China ships to Europe, Europe raises their barriers. Who's going to absorb this capacity? It's a perennial issue.
And I think the perennial proposed solution has been we all need to get together and make them eat it, basically. But that gets back to something that Barbara said. Getting together to get them to do that has turned out to be very difficult. There has been an OECD SEAL committee for, 30 years at least. Of course, China's a member, so it's not a big surprise that they haven't accomplished very much. But is there any hope out there that this is an area where we could gang up? I mean, one of the things that I think we noted on the podcast either last week or the week before is that a number of other countries have figured this out, not just on steel, but so you've got the EU, Canada, India, Turkey, South Africa, Brazil, Indonesia, all either contemplating or taking adverse tariff measures against China on various things. Do you think it's possible to get people to all get together? And how can they do it and be consistent with WTO rules at the same time is the tricky part of the question.
Well, it seems like there should be a coalition of the willing that could come together. But one of the problems with this administration, I think, is that they treat our allies very poorly when it comes to trade. And so it's hard to build that cooperation when they're fighting other battles, particularly with Canada and Mexico and the EU. So I don't know, Barbara, do you have anything to add in on that?
I mean, I think it is certainly possible that the administration, after this initial salvo, decides that there are countries that they want to work together with. But their approach so far has been very bilateral. So at least at this point, I wouldn't expect that they're going to be contemplating doing something plurilateral. But I think for people observing the problem, that is the obvious answer.
One of the interesting features of virtually now all of the things he's proposed is that there's a time lag. The Canadian and Mexican ones, that was a postponement, but the steel ones are going into effect a month later. These are going into effect, the reciprocal ones. I think Secretary Lutnick I guess he's Secretary-designate Lutnick. I don't think he's been voted on yet. Said after Trump made his announcement today that they could go in as early as April 2nd. So that's 6 weeks away at best. So do you think this is negotiating time? Is this negotiating leverage? Or is it just going to take them that long to figure out what they're going to do?
I think a lot of the initial pronouncements came without the economic team in place. And as you said, not everyone's been confirmed. And there has to be some process to evaluating what products the tariffs go on, making sure that the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed in terms of the legality of this. So it could be that he's just trying to soften up other countries and make them come to him with some sort of offerings that could postpone them. Or it could just be that bureaucracy is grinding and they're moving along. When the team is in place, we'll see action taking place.
So if you were the Prime Minister of Canada, what would you do today?
Well, I would talk to the president of Mexico because it seems like Mexico has been very effective in sort of appeasing Trump and delaying, more so than I would have thought. I would have thought that would be the more antagonistic relationship, but it seems like the president doesn't like Justin Trudeau and the Canadians, perhaps more than the Mexicans.
He doesn't seem to, but in a way they both followed, and the Chinese in a way have followed, I think, a classic pattern here, which is stand up for your own sovereignty, which you need to do for domestic political purposes, but don't poke him in the eye. Just say it and move on. Make small concessions, best if they're ones you've made before, and hope he doesn't remember. And then when he declares victory, don't contradict. No eye rolling, no speeches saying, no, we won. Let him take the victory and move on. And that's what she did. And then I think Trudeau figured that out that afternoon, did the same thing. And in a way, the Chinese are kind of doing this too. Their response to the 10% tariffs was unexpectedly moderate. And I think what that does is set the stage for a negotiation. Barbara, did you have to negotiate with the Chinese during your time? You didn't have to do that. All right. I won't put you on the spot then. But I'm forecasting kind of a replay of 2018, 2019, 2020. I was at a meeting this morning where this came up, and the consensus was the main thing the Chinese want in the negotiation will be for us to remove our export controls, which is the last thing that we will concede. And so it's hard to envision a big deal, but I don't know. Scott, do you have...
Well, what strikes me about the conversation on reciprocal tariffs is we have yet to mention all those diplomats enjoying lunch at the Pearl de Lac and having their cars drive them through Geneva traffic. There is a World Trade Organization. And if you want to tee up a negotiation in tariff reciprocity on industrial goods, that seems like a good place to do it, and yet it never comes to mind as a forum that we ought to consider. So I'm not sure whether its reputation slipped that far or whether people are just trying to save their own skins. But it is odd that the multilateral system has gotten to the point where it's not a top-of-mind solution to any particular problem.
Do you want to comment on the WTO? Isn't everything he's doing violating the rules?
Pretty much. But of course, there's domestic laws you've talked about many times on the program that does allow him some leeway, ignoring the WTO. I think the reason, though, that he wouldn't do exactly what Scott was suggesting is that he's not truly interested in reciprocity. NAFTA or USMCA is reciprocity. We zero out tariffs on all sides of the border. That's a level playing field. But that's not satisfying because I think his instincts are mercantilist. He's worried about the trade balance. And so even if you had the equal tariffs on both sides, if the trade is imbalanced, that's a cause of grievance for him and something he'd want to address in some way. So I'm not sure that true reciprocity is the ultimate outcome they're driving for. Actually, I did have a question on a previous point because you raised how well the Canadians and the Mexicans had handled him. But I wonder about the Europeans because they're not quite as dependent as our neighbors in North America. And it seems like they're a little bit, maybe even more upset. And I wonder if they will take that conciliatory approach to Trump that you just outlined.
Yeah, it remains to be seen. I think they're trying to figure out what to do. The interesting element now is everybody's seen this movie before. This is Trump 2.0. Right. So all these moves, I think, are not as unexpected as they were the first time. So there's been plenty of time to plan. The EU has the additional challenge of trying to get all 27 of them to agree on something. And my own view has been that Trump's strategy is going to be to try to break them up and play countries off against each other. We already had the tariff on Denmark because of Greenland. And, is he going to give Hungary a break because he likes Orban? Is he going to be, nasty to the Germans? I don't know. Scott, you have a view?
Well, there are more issues that the president is involved in than just reciprocal tariffs. With Europe, particularly the NATO members, he's got an idea of how to settle Ukraine with the Russians. That will take cooperation. And so there's got to be some balancing here. I've heard from both the previous Trump appointed officials and others who support his point of view, frustrations with the value-added tax, frustration with the results of previous tariff negotiations, and wanting to redo those things. But there are a lot more issues on the table for the president. It's a strange and dangerous world right at the moment. I think he'll need some friends.
That opens up another topic maybe I can ask Doug about. The new development does seem to be tariffs as a tool to achieve non-economic goals. He seems to have, as I've said before, one narrative, victimization, one metric, the bilateral deficit, one tool. And now the tool is about Greenland. The tool is about migrants. Is this a new thing, or has the United States done this before?
Well, occasionally we've used trade policy to strong-arm countries into doing certain things. I think we held up the turning over of Okinawa to Japan. We linked that to textile quotas on their exports coming to the U.S. And there are a few other instances, but he's really taken it to a new level. One reason we have the WTO and trade rules is we want to put tariffs into a particular box where we don't touch that box, we don't pull the alarm to keep trade settled. And we use other tools of diplomacy, could be foreign aid, could be military aid, other pressure points to achieve those non-economic objectives. But now that box has been broken, and now tariffs are being used for all manner of things.
And how do you see that playing out?
It's going to be very complicated because if it's your tool of first resort and you want to use it for all sorts of things, I think it will diminish in terms of its power over time. And it creates tremendous uncertainty for the business environment in terms of you never know what country is going to get potentially hit with something. Colombia, we have a free trade agreement with Colombia, but they were on the firing lines within days of the administration taking over. So even a free trade agreement won't protect you from the ire of the president.
Can I just add on that uncertainty point? I think, you were talking about the impact on the U.S. economy of all of this. You recall back when they were concluding the USMCA and the ITC did a study, as it's required to do. And the study showed one of the main benefits of the new USMCA was the certainty that was going to come from this. And then it added to whatever the economic impact was in a positive way because of the certainty. And now we've created a period of endless uncertainty, not just in terms of what they're going to do between now and April or whenever these decisions are made, but whenever the president decides he wants to use tariffs as a threat, now you have a new level of uncertainty. So I think the question I have for you is, what do you think the impact is going to be on the U.S. economy, but also on, the business community altogether? Because based on conversations we all have been having, everybody seems to be, really uncertain about where things are headed and how they should respond to them.
It can affect households in terms of accelerating purchases in advance of potential tariffs and then holding off later on. It could also affect business investment plans quite a bit because you don't know exactly what your supply chain situation will be. And of course, it will affect investment into Canada and Mexico. So it can't be good on any of these dimensions.
Scott's our supply chain expert, but I'm going to preempt him for a minute and just ask you to pursue that for a minute. How is this going to affect U.S. company supply chains?
Well, I defer to Scott, who knows a lot more, but once again, it creates that uncertainty. And one of the many problems with uncertainty is that even a trade agreement won't relieve that uncertainty because he negotiated the USMCA and now it's being sort of ripped up. And so if you reach an agreement to provide, that framework, you don't know. It'll be 1 month or 6 months or a year down the road. Everything could be fresh because there's some new issue in the relationship. So I think that gets to the credibility of the administration negotiating and reaching certain agreements and whether they will hold over time.
Well, for North American producers, one of the benefits of the past negotiation and the conclusion of USMCA is about 90% of the agreement didn't change from the original NAFTA. and that was good because many companies, including the one I spent most of my career at, aligned its supply networks as if there was a single economic unit of North America. And so you base loaded facilities. So, for instance, you had, say, lightweight products like diapers or paper towels. What you really wanted to avoid were not national borders, but mountain ranges. And so you had sort of east of the Rockies, west of the Rockies supply situation, but all three economies within those networks. In some cases, you had a single plant producing for the entire North American market. And so when tariffs get applied in that what has been essentially a tariff-free planning environment from a supply standpoint for 25 years, it gets tough. It gets difficult. So that will be a big change and one that there'll have to be additional supplies. There'll have to be a number of measures taken internally to avoid disruption and out of stocks and the kinds of things that are very bad for the business. So it'll be a mess, but it was one of those things. Predictable environments are what most supply network assumptions are based on. And when you lose predictability, all bets are off.
I've been thinking it'll have an impact on investment as well. When I was at the National Foreign Trade Council representing big companies, we concluded, sort of at the 40,000 meter level, the things they looked at when they were deciding where to go for new FDI were rule of law, policy stability, and commercial dispute resolution system that was transparent, objective, and efficient. And Trump's trashing all three of those. So it seems to me if you were an investor, a foreign investor, I mean, his point has been repeatedly on the tariffs. One of the points of the tariffs is to get foreign companies to move here and manufacture here. So one question is, do you think that will happen? And I guess my at least partial answer is that if I were a foreign investor, I'd think long and hard about that right now. It's a certainty issue that Scott just talked about.
Yeah, I'm not sure I can add much on that, except to say that since multinational production is so internationally sourced, even investing in the U.S., yes, you can avoid the tariffs, but your inputs are important and you have to be competitive there. And so if you don't have certainty there, either it's going to make you less efficient in your U.S. investment, or it's going to temper how much you're willing to commit to the U.S.
Talk a little bit about, or let's think a little bit about implementation too. If he does this reciprocal thing, which seems to be that he will calibrate U.S. tariffs differently for each country and for each product, depending upon what they're doing. So we won't have 2 tariff schedules. We'll have 200 plus tariff schedules, one for each country. I mean, some of them will be the same, but they won't be all different. And my immediate thoughts, so tell me why I'm wrong, were first, that makes origin much more important than it used to be. You know, if you have an MFN tariff, it doesn't really matter that much about where it came from unless it's coming from North Korea or, one of the countries on the naughty list. But if you're going to have a different tariff for every country, origin becomes very important, which means there's a huge new incentive for fraud, mislabeling, or transshipment through other countries, and an enormous administrative burden on companies that are trying to source things. Or am I missing something here? Is this all going to be simple and we can get this all figured out by April 2nd and everybody will fall into line?
No, I think you're absolutely right. I think they're going to apply it selectively in their pick products and countries and what have you. But if taken to, its face value, we have 13,000 line items in the tariff code, and we trade with about 200 countries. That makes 2.6 million individual tariff rates. And you're right, the pressure for exemptions, companies are going to try to resource or change the product category to get under a different tariff line and reduce the tariff. All sorts of gamesmanship is going to take place politically, and then just in terms of what you can do in terms of the types of products you're bringing in.
One of the things that journalists have proven to be really good at in these situations are digging up companies, usually small ones, that are going to get hit by this and that can explain in some detail why they can't get whatever it is from anywhere else but where they're getting it from, and why they're going to go broke because of what this has just happened. So we can expect those stories to appear. There's already been a couple in the Washington Post. Predictably, small companies who source from China in this particular case and can't make it domestically and still be competitive. And so they're trapped. I mean, Scott, if you're only going to impose tariffs against a handful of countries, then I guess you can create trade diversion, find somewhere else. But if they do this to everybody, then we're kind of stuck.
Right.
Yes, that's true. It's more difficult than people suspect. And I remember having this conversation back in Trump 1.0 with staff and appointees. There was a lot of hand-waving about the $1 trillion a year of imports, which are intermediate goods. I said, well, we'll just get them somewhere else. Well, no, you won't, right? And so I've had some very specific experience with that in the chemicals industry, where you have an ingredient or something that is made under the producer's patents, and it's only made in one place. And so you either use that ingredient or you don't. But there is no alternative source because of either intellectual property or just the pure capacity necessary. So it's one of these things that it's much more complex than people account for, and it's going to be a game of whack-a-mole in every purchasing office around the world.
Well, that's not good news for anybody, I think.
One other implication I'll just raise is that we're assuming the U.S. tariffs are going to go up. But here's where it's going to be selective reciprocity, because New Zealand, if they don't have tariffs on dairy, are we going to match them and allow dairy from New Zealand to come in? Brazil, a big net export of sugar, they don't need a sugar tariff. Are we going to match their sugar tariff and allow sugar in? Of course not. It doesn't make political sense. And so it's not going to be pure reciprocity in any sense. It's going to be a lot of administrative decisions about who to include, what to include, and things of that sort. And that just adds to the complexity and the uncertainty of the whole scheme.
Well, it also works the other way. If a country, for example, has a high tariff because they want to protect their domestic industry, hypothetically, Colombia has a high tariff on coffee because they want to protect Colombian coffee. So we're going to charge that tariff on Colombian coffee when we don't make any coffee of our own. So maybe it has to be selective. But that then raises the question of if you're going to be selective, that's going to take a long time, about 13,000 tariff schedule categories. And what did you say? 2.6 million potentially individual rates.
Yep. If you're doing it country by country, that's what it adds up to.
So, Barbara, does the USTR have the person power to do that?
They absolutely do not. I think when you consider the negotiation country by country and the amount of time it takes to negotiate a trade deal, any one trade deal, I think the fastest that we ever did a trade deal was Jordan in something like 4 or 5 months. And there was very little limited trade there, so it didn't matter that much. But when you think about just the volume of work entailed in negotiating tariff schedules and rules of origin that don't exist for trade with a lot of these countries, it's mind-boggling the amount of time that this would take.
Let's maybe close with a big picture question, or Scott can have the last word. The penultimate bigger picture question. What does this mean for the trading system? Are we reverting to the law of the jungle or not? And if so, can the U.S. thrive in the law of the jungle and other countries lose? And that's perfectly okay with Trump, or do you see a different outcome?
Well, I'll sort of go back to the first Trump term, because I think a lot of us who believe in the international system and the rule of international law, in particular trade rules, hope that this might be an exception and that we could revert to normal if Trump didn't win re-election, which he didn't. But unfortunately, the Biden administration didn't really do much to repair some of the damage and didn't focus on the WTO so much. And now, so we're having a third presidential term in a row, and it makes one think that it's really hard to come back from this and revitalize the WTO. One of the things you mentioned, the Great Depression earlier on, tariff barriers are sort of relatively easy to go up, but they're slow to come down. And so the more that it goes up over the next 3 years or so, it's going to take a while to undo this. It's going to take a while to regain credibility in terms of negotiations. And it could be the political environment in the U.S. has just changed so that going back to an international system is not where we're going to go.
Well, one vaguely promising sign, just to end on a high note, was that yesterday the administration actually nominated somebody to be our ambassador to the WTO. So they're not giving up entirely. They're going to send somebody there, Joe Barloon, who had been general counsel of USTR in Trump 1.0. I don't know him, but he seems to have relevant credentials at least. Do you know him, Barbara?
No.
But at least they've appointed somebody. That's a good sign. Scott, anything else from you?
Doug, first of all, it's been a great pleasure having you on the program. We're delighted you made time for us. But for me, the reminder is that you forget how useful rules are until they no longer exist. And we're pushing the envelope here on where we've created this system where the underlying assumptions are very basic, assumptions about non-discrimination and about things like national treatment and MFN treatment. And these are amazingly beneficial to all the commercial actors in the system. And we forget how bad it would be to lose them until they're gone. So I think Joni Mitchell wrote a song about that, but that's closing from another decade. But Doug, thanks for being here. And Barbara, it's great to hear your voice and glad you could join us today.
Yes, and my thanks too to both Doug and Barbara for enlightening us. Listeners, you can be sure there's going to be a lot more to be said about what Trump is doing, and there may even be more news between now and next week. So hang on to your seats tight.
To our listeners, if you have a question for the Trade Guys, write us at tradeguys@csis.org. That's tradeguys@csis.org. We'll read some of your emails and have the Trade Guys react to it. You've been listening to The Trade Guys, a CSIS podcast.